I've spent the better part of 15 years studying World War II, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. We got it wrong. Not just a little wrong, we got it completely, utterly wrong about what that war really was. See, if you're like most folks my age or older, you probably learned about the war through Hollywood movies and history books that focused on D-Day, Pearl Harbor, maybe the Pacific Island campaigns. That's what we were taught mattered. That's what we were told defined the war. But there was another front. A front so savage, so absolutely beyond human comprehension, that even today, 80 years later, most Americans have no idea what really happened there. I'm talking about the Eastern Front. The war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And let me tell you something right up front, what happened on those endless Russian plains makes everything else in that war look like a playground scuffle. I'm not being dramatic here. I'm being honest. Brutally, necessarily honest. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, well, war is war. It's all terrible. And you're right. War is terrible. But what I'm about to share with you over the next 2 hours isn't just terrible. It's something else entirely. It's a descent into a hell that most of us can't even imagine. I've read the diaries. I've studied the photographs that were never meant to be seen. I've pored over testimonies from men who lived through this nightmare and somehow found the strength to talk about it decades later. And every single time I dive deeper into this subject, I'm left shaking my head, wondering how any human beings, survived what they went through. The Eastern Front wasn't just the largest military campaign in human history. It was the most vicious, most unforgiving, most absolutely merciless killing ground ever created. From June of 1941 to May of 1945, 27 million Soviet citizens died. 27 million. That's more than the entire population of Texas today. And on the German side, well, they lost about 4 million soldiers on that front alone. 4 million boys and men who marched east believing they were part of some grand crusade, only to discover they'd walked straight into the mouth of hell itself. But here's what really gets me. Here's what keeps me up at night sometimes. Most of those deaths weren't quick. They weren't clean. They weren't the kind of deaths you see in war movies, where a soldier gets shot and falls over with a peaceful expression. No, most of these people died slowly. They froze to death in trenches filled with mud and blood. They starved in encirclements that lasted for months. They succumbed to diseases that ate away at their bodies while they were still trying to fight. They burned alive in tanks, or suffocated in bunkers, or simply disappeared into the vast emptiness of the Russian winter, never to be found again. And the truly heartbreaking part? So many of them were just kids, 18, 19, 20 years old. Boys who should have been worrying about girls and jobs and what to do with their lives. Instead, they found themselves in a meat grinder that consumed human beings at a rate history had never seen before and, God willing, will never see again. I want to take you back to where it all began. June 22nd, 1941, 3:15 in the morning. Along an 1,800-mile front stretching from the Baltic Sea down to the Black Sea, the largest military operation in human history exploded into life. Operation Barbarossa, they called it. 3.5 million German soldiers, backed by their allies, smashed across the Soviet border like a tidal wave of steel and fire. The sound alone must have been unimaginable, thousands of artillery pieces firing at once, tanks grinding forward, aircraft roaring overhead. Picture this, imagine you're a Russian border guard that morning. You've been told to watch for German activity, but nobody really believes Hitler would be stupid enough to fight a war on two fronts. Then suddenly, without any warning at all, the entire world explodes around you. The ground shakes so hard you can't stand up. The sky lights up like the sun itself has fallen to earth. And through the smoke and fire and chaos, you see them coming wave after wave of gray uniformed soldiers, backed by more tanks and guns than you ever imagined could exist. That's how it started. That's how the nightmare began. Now, the German soldiers marching across that border weren't monsters. Not yet, anyway. They were just young men, most of them barely out of their teens. They'd been told they were going to save the world from Bolshevism. They'd been promised they'd be home by Christmas. Their officers had assured them that the Red Army was weak, poorly led, ready to collapse at the first real push. Many of them were carrying letters from home, photographs of their sweethearts, maybe a Bible or a lucky charm their mother had given them. They had clean uniforms, full packs, confidence born of victory in France and Poland and Norway. They believed they were invincible, and for the first few weeks it looked like they were right. The German advance in those early days was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Army Group North smashed toward Leningrad. Army Group Center drove straight for Moscow. Army Group South carved through Ukraine like a hot knife through butter. In the first week alone, German forces advanced 30 to 50 miles a day. Entire Soviet armies simply vanished, surrounded, captured, destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers found themselves herded into makeshift prison camps, many so confused they didn't even understand what had happened to them. One German soldier, just a regular infantryman, wrote home to his wife saying the war felt like a march through cornfields interrupted only by the burning of another village. Can you imagine that? Can you picture what that must have looked like? Mile after mile of beautiful countryside, golden wheat swaying in the summer breeze, and in the distance, the black smoke of another town being destroyed. The weather was perfect that first summer. The roads, such as they were, held up under the weight of the German war machine. Supply trucks kept pace with the advancing troops. The Luftwaffe owned the skies. Everything seemed to be going exactly according to plan. But even then, even in those first triumphant weeks, there were signs that this wasn't going to be the easy campaign the Germans had expected. You see, the Soviet Union wasn't just big, it was vast beyond German comprehension. When you're used to fighting in countries like France or Belgium, where you can drive from one border to the other in a few hours, suddenly finding yourself in a country that stretches for thousands of miles in every direction. Well, that changes things. And the Russians weren't just rolling over and surrendering, either. Oh sure, hundreds of thousands did surrender in those first few weeks. But for every unit that gave up, there was another that fought to the last man. Take the Brest Fortress, for instance. This was supposed to fall in the first day, maybe 2 days at most. Instead, the Soviet garrison held out for over a month, fighting from the rubble even after the Germans had officially captured the fortress. Then there were the ambushes. Small groups of Red Army soldiers who'd been bypassed would hide in the forests and swamps, then strike at German supply columns when they least expected it. A truck full of ammunition would be driving down a quiet country road. The crew may be talking about home or sharing a cigarette, and suddenly machine gun fire would erupt from the trees. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones, well, we'll get to that later. And the deeper the Germans pushed into Russia, the more the country itself seemed to fight back against them. The Soviets had a policy they called scorched earth. They destroyed everything as they retreated. Bridges, railways, factories, food stores, even the crops in the fields. They poisoned wells, burned granaries, slaughtered livestock rather than let it fall into German hands. So while the German army was advancing rapidly, they were advancing through an increasingly barren wasteland. Supply lines stretched thinner and thinner. Trucks broke down on roads that were little more than dirt tracks. And always, there was the nagging worry, often in the middle of the night, and they'd have to fight for the same ground all over again. The casualties were staggering. German companies that had started the campaign with 150 men were down to 50 or 60. Medical stations were overwhelmed with wounded soldiers, many of whom would never fight again. And still the orders came down from above. Keep attacking, keep pushing, victory is just ahead. That's when some of the German soldiers began to understand that this wasn't going to be the easy war they'd been promised. This was going to be something else entirely. And then came winter. Now, I want you folks to understand something about Russian winter. If you've lived through a bad winter in places like Minnesota or North Dakota, you might think you know what cold is. But Russian winter, especially the winter of 1941 to 42, was something beyond normal human experience. By November, temperatures were dropping to 20, 30, 40 degrees below zero. The ground froze so hard that digging a foxhole required pickaxes and sometimes explosives. Snow fell so heavily that entire units would disappear for days at a time, lost in whiteout blizzards that made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. And the German army was completely unprepared for it. Remember, these boys had been told they'd be home by Christmas. Nobody had bothered to issue them winter clothing. Their uniforms were the same light wool they'd worn in France. Their boots were standard leather, fine for marching on paved roads but utterly useless for trudging through knee-deep snow and ice. So what happened? Well, they started dying. Not from bullets or shells, but from the cold itself. Frostbite became epidemic. Men would go to sleep with 10 fingers and 10 toes, and wake up with some of them black and dead. If they were lucky, they might find a medic with a saw to cut off the dead parts before gangrene set in. If they weren't lucky, well, infection was just another way to die on the Eastern Front. But the cold did more than just freeze flesh. It turned the simple act of fighting into a nightmare. Rifle bolts would freeze solid. Soldiers had to warm them with their bare hands before they could fire, which meant exposing their skin to metal in sub-zero temperatures. Machine guns jammed constantly. Vehicle engines wouldn't start. Tanks became useless metal coffins, too cold inside to operate, too visible outside to approach safely. And that's when the Red Army struck back. You see, while the Germans were freezing and dying, the Soviets were thriving. They had winter uniforms, white camouflage parkas, fur-lined boots, padded gloves. They knew how to fight in snow and ice. They could ski across frozen ground that the Germans couldn't even walk on. In December of 1941, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive along the entire front. Fresh divisions from Siberia, men who'd grown up in conditions that would kill a European in hours, came crashing into German positions that were held by soldiers who were literally freezing to death at their posts. The retreat that followed was unlike anything in German military history. Units that had advanced hundreds of miles in the summer found themselves falling back in complete chaos. Equipment was abandoned. Wounded soldiers were left behind. Entire formations simply disintegrated under the combined pressure of Soviet attacks and the brutal cold. I've read accounts from German soldiers during that retreat, and they're heartbreaking. Men wrote about comrades who sat down in the snow to rest and never got up again. They described finding frozen sentries still at their posts, eyes open, rifles in their hands, dead for hours or even days. They talked about the sound the snow made when you walked on it. Not the soft crunch you might expect, but a harsh squeaking because it was so cold that normal snow couldn't exist. And through it all, the Red Army kept coming. Soviet ski troops would appear out of blizzards like ghosts, attack German supply columns or isolated outposts, then disappear back into the white emptiness before reinforcements could arrive. It was psychological warfare at its most brutal. The Germans never knew where the next attack would come from, or if they'd live to see the next sunrise. But winter was just the beginning. What came next made those first months look like a warm-up. In August of 1942, the German army launched what would become their final great offensive on the Eastern Front. The target was a city that most Americans probably couldn't even pronounce correctly: Stalingrad. Now, strategically, Stalingrad was important because it controlled access to the Volga River and the oil fields of the Caucasus. But what happened there over the next 6 months had nothing to do with strategy. It became something much more personal, much more vicious. It became a symbol for both sides of who would ultimately win this war. The battle began on August 23rd with a bombardment that lasted for hours. German artillery and aircraft pounded the city until whole neighborhoods simply ceased to exist. The Volga itself seemed to catch fire as oil storage tanks exploded, sending burning fuel floating downstream. When the smoke cleared and the German infantry advanced into the city, they found hell on earth. Stalingrad had been a beautiful city before the war. Wide boulevards, parks, theaters, schools. Families had lived there for generations. Children had played in those streets. Young couples had fallen in love walking along the river. By September of 1942, it was nothing but rubble and smoke and death. The fighting in Stalingrad wasn't warfare as civilized people understand it. It was something more primitive, more savage. Germans and Russians fought each other with rifles and grenades and bayonets, but also with knives and clubs and sometimes just bare hands. They fought room by room, through forests of twisted metal and broken machinery, never knowing if the shadow ahead of them was friend or enemy. The apartment buildings became vertical battlefields where you might control the first floor while your enemy held the third floor, and both sides would fight for days over a single staircase. And through it all, through the constant explosions and gunfire and screaming, there was the smell. The smell of cordite and smoke, yes, but also the smell of death. Bodies couldn't be buried in the city because of the constant fighting, so they just lay where they fell. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. German, Russian, civilian, all mixed together in the rubble. I want to tell you about one particular building in Stalingrad. It was called the Grain Elevator, a massive concrete structure near the river. For 2 months, a small group of Soviet soldiers held it against repeated German attacks. Think about that for a moment. 2 months. 60 days of fighting in a building that was being shelled and bombed constantly. The defenders were running out of ammunition, running out of food, running out of everything except the will to keep fighting. German assault teams would blast their way in through one wall, only to be driven out by desperate defenders firing from behind heaps of grain that had long since been mixed with concrete dust and human blood. When the building finally fell in late October, the Germans found the bodies of the last Soviet defenders still at their positions, still facing toward the enemy. They'd literally fought to the last man, just as their commanders had ordered. And that was just one building. There were hundreds of similar fights going on all across the city, every single day, for months. But the worst part about Stalingrad, the part that really shows you how far humanity had fallen on the Eastern Front, was what happened to the wounded. In a normal battle, when a soldier gets hurt, medics try to evacuate him to a hospital. But in Stalingrad, there were no hospitals. There were no safe places. The wounded had to be treated right there in the rubble, often under fire, with whatever medical supplies could be scrounged up. I've read testimony from a German medic who described trying to operate on wounded soldiers by flashlight in the basement of a bombed-out building, while Russian artillery shells shook dust down from the ceiling. He said he performed amputations with a rusty saw, disinfected wounds with stolen vodka, and used pages torn from books as bandages. And if that medic couldn't save you, well, there was nowhere to take bodies for proper burial. So the dead were just stacked, like cordwood, Germans and Russians together, because death didn't care what uniform you were wearing. The living soldiers, the ones still fighting, had to step over these piles of bodies to get to their positions. They ate their meager rations sitting next to corpses. They slept curled up against dead comrades for warmth. Death became so common, so constant, that it stopped being shocking. It just became part of the landscape. And then, on November 19, 1942, the whole strategic picture changed in a matter of hours. The Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a massive pincer movement that cut through the Romanian armies protecting the German flanks and completely surrounded the entire 6th Army in Stalingrad. Suddenly, the hunters had become the hunted. 300,000 German soldiers found themselves trapped in a pocket maybe 30 miles wide, with winter coming on and no way to get supplies except by air. And the Red Army wasn't just going to sit back and wait for them to starve. They kept attacking, kept pushing, a glass of orange juice. I try to imagine what it would be like to be slowly starving to death in the middle of a battle zone. To be so hungry that you'd fight over a moldy crust of bread. So desperate that you'd eat things that would make you sick just to put something, anything, in your stomach. And these weren't just random statistics I'm talking about. These were real people. Boys who had mothers and fathers and girlfriends back home. Young men who'd had dreams and plans for their lives after the war. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a frozen hell, watching their friends die one by one, knowing that they would probably die too, but still having to get up every morning and fight. The end, when it came, was both inevitable and shocking. On January 31, 1943, Field Marshal Paulus, the commander of the 6th Army, surrendered what remained of his forces to the Soviets. Of the 300,000 German soldiers who'd been trapped in Stalingrad, maybe 90,000 were of their units. Divisions that had started the war with 15,000 men now numbered in the hundreds. Equipment that had once been the envy of the world was abandoned by the roadside when it broke down or ran out of fuel. And behind them, always behind them, came the Red Army. Not the confused, poorly led force the Germans had faced in 1941, but a hardened, vengeful machine that had learned to fight with ruthless efficiency. Soviet tank armies would punch through German defenses like a fist through paper, then race ahead to cut off whole army groups from retreat routes. The individual soldier, The poor bastard with a rifle who had to actually fight these battles found himself in situations that defied human comprehension. I've read accounts of German companies ordered to hold positions until relieved, knowing full well that no relief was coming, that they were being sacrificed to buy time for some larger unit to escape. These men would dig shallow foxholes in ground so frozen they could barely scratch the surface, then wait for Soviet attacks that came like clockwork, at dawn, at dusk, sometimes in the middle of the night. They fought with weapons so worn out they barely functioned, ate food that was more mold than nutrition, and wore uniforms that had rotted off their bodies from constant exposure to the elements. You know what really gets to me? It's the letters. The letters these soldiers wrote home, when they had paper to write on and a way to send mail, which wasn't often. I've read letters from German soldiers in 1944 and 1945, and the change from their earlier correspondence is heartbreaking. In 1941, they wrote about victory and coming home soon. By 1944, they were writing about how cold they were, how hungry, how tired. They asked their families to pray for them. They talked about dreams they'd had of home, of sitting by a warm fire or eating their mother's cooking. But what really breaks your heart is how many of those letters end. Not with "see you soon" or "the war will be over by Christmas," the optimistic phrases from earlier years. Instead, they end with things like, "remember me as I was," or "take care of each other," or simply "goodbye." These boys knew they weren't coming home. They knew they were going to die in some godforsaken field or forest, thousands of miles from everything they'd ever loved. But they kept fighting anyway because what else could they do? The Soviet revenge, when it came, was terrible to behold. You have to understand, by 1944, the Red Army wasn't just fighting to defend their homeland anymore. They were fighting to pay back 4 years of the most brutal occupation in human history. German forces hadn't just conquered Soviet territory. They'd systematically destroyed it. They'd murdered millions of civilians, burned thousands of villages, enslaved whole populations. So when the Red Army finally crossed into German territory in early 1945, they brought that rage with them. The retreat through East Prussia was particularly horrific. German civilians who had lived there for generations suddenly found themselves in the path of a Soviet army that had very good reason to hate everything German. The stories that came out of that campaign, well, they're not the kind of thing you talk about over dinner. Millions of German civilians fled westward ahead of the advancing Soviets, often in the middle of winter, carrying whatever they could in carts and wagons. The roads became clogged with refugees, old men, women, children, all trying to escape the approaching storm. Many didn't make it. I've seen photographs of those refugee columns that will haunt me until the day I die. Hundreds of civilian bodies scattered along snowy roads, frozen in the positions where they fell. Abandoned wagons full of belongings that had once been precious to someone, now just debris left behind in the race for survival. And the German soldiers who were supposed to protect these civilians? Most of them were too busy trying to save themselves. Units would receive orders to cover the evacuation of some town or city, then discover that the civilians had already fled and the Red Army was already there. The final battle, the Battle of Berlin in April and May of 1945, was the perfect symbol of what the Eastern Front had become. Here was the capital of the Reich, the city Hitler had promised would stand for 1,000 years, being torn apart street by an army of men who had every reason to want revenge. The German defenders were no longer the confident soldiers who had marched into Russia 4 years earlier. They were old men and teenage boys, many of whom had never fired a weapon before. They were foreign volunteers who didn't even speak German. They were wounded veterans pulled from hospital beds and handed rifles they could barely hold. They fought from the rubble of their own city, using subway tunnels and bombed-out buildings as fortresses, knowing that every hour they held out was probably their last. Soviet artillery pounded the city day and night. Soviet aircraft ruled the skies. Soviet tanks rolled down the boulevards where Nazi rallies had once been held. The irony was impossible to miss. The same army that had once promised to conquer the world was now reduced to defending the ruins of its own capital with weapons scavenged from the dead and ammunition counted by the bullet. And when it was over, when Hitler was dead and Berlin had fallen and the surviving German forces finally surrendered, the Eastern Front didn't just end. It simply stopped. like a machine that had finally broken down from the sheer weight of horror it had produced. The aftermath was almost as terrible as the war itself. Millions of German soldiers became prisoners of war in the Soviet Union. Of the 3 million who were captured during the war, only about 2 million would ever return home, and many of those didn't come back until the 1950s, broken men who had spent a decade in labor camps that were almost as deadly as the battlefields they'd left behind. The prisoners who survived the camps, and many didn't, came home to a Germany that no longer existed. Their cities had been bombed flat. Their families were dead or scattered. Their country had been divided between the victorious Allies. The world they had known was simply gone. But it wasn't just the Germans who suffered in defeat. The Soviet Union had won the war, but through what they'd experienced. How do you explain to your wife or your children what it was like to fight in Stalingrad? How do you describe the smell of a mass grave to someone whose biggest worry is paying the electric bill? As I've gotten older, I've come to realize that the real tragedy of the Eastern Front wasn't just the millions who died there. It was the millions who survived and had to live with the knowledge of what human beings are capable of doing to each other when civilization breaks down. These men, German and Russian alike, had seen the very worst of humanity. They'd witnessed cruelty that surpassed anything in their wildest nightmares. And somehow they had to find a way to believe in goodness again, to trust in human decency, to have faith that such things could never happen again. Some managed it. They went home, rebuilt their lives, raised families, and tried to put the war behind them. They became teachers and farmers and shopkeepers and grandfathers. They chose to focus on the future rather than the past. Others never recovered. The war had broken something inside them that couldn't be fixed. They lived out their remaining years as ghostly figures, physically present but emotionally absent, forever trapped in the frozen trenches and burning cities they'd left behind decades earlier. And here's what really troubles me as I think about all this: how quickly we forgot. Within a few years of the war's end, American attention had moved on to other things. The Cold War, Korea, Vietnam, civil rights, the space race. There was always something new to capture our attention. The Eastern Front became just another chapter in history books, just another set of statistics to memorize for school tests. But those weren't just statistics. Those were real people who lived and died in circumstances we can barely imagine. Every one of those 27 million Soviet dead was somebody's son during those 4 years. Maybe we'll be a little more careful about the choices we make in our own time. Because the men who fought on the Eastern Front weren't monsters. They weren't aliens from another planet. They were people just like us, people who thought they were doing the right thing, people who were caught up in forces larger than themselves, people who found themselves in situations where the normal rules of human decency simply didn't apply. So let me ask you something. After everything I've told you over the past 2 hours, do you still think the Eastern Front was just another theater of World War II? Do you still think it was comparable to D-Day or the Pacific campaigns? Or do you now understand, as I do, that what happened on those endless Russian plains was something uniquely terrible in human history? A descent into barbarism so complete, so absolute, that we still struggle to comprehend it 80 years later? I'll leave you with one final thought. In all my years of studying this subject, reading testimony from survivors, examining photographs and documents, I keep coming back to the same question. How did any of them maintain their humanity in the face of such inhuman circumstances? And you know what? Many of them didn't. The Eastern Front changed everyone it touched, often in ways that could never be undone. But some of them, a precious few, managed to hold on to something essentially human even in the depths of that hell. They showed kindness to enemies, mercy to prisoners, compassion to the wounded. They shared their last piece of bread with a stranger, risked their lives to save a comrade, chose love over hate even when hate would have been so much easier. Those people, those ordinary human beings who refused to let extraordinary circumstances destroy their souls, they're the real heroes of this story. Not because they won battles or captured territory, but because they proved that even in the darkest moments in human history, the light of human decency can still shine through. The Eastern Front was worse than we think. Much worse. But it was also a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. And maybe that's the lesson we most need to remember today. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring enough about history to spend 2 hours learning about events that most people would rather forget. And please, Please don't let these stories die with our generation. Tell your children and grandchildren what you've learned here today. Make sure they understand the price that was paid for the world they live in. Because if we forget the Eastern Front, if we let those 27 million Soviet dead and 4 million German dead become just numbers in a history book, then we dishonor not just their memory, but our own humanity as well. Remember them. Remember what they endured. And pray that we never see their like again. But remembering isn't enough. Not anymore. You see, as I look around at our world today, at the divisions in our own country, they were taught to see other people as less than human. They were told that their problems were caused by those people over there, the ones who looked different or spoke different or believed different things. And once you stop seeing other people as human beings, well, we've just spent 2 hours talking about where that leads. Second, I want you to talk to your children and grandchildren about this. Not in some abstract way, not as a history lesson they need to memorize for school. I want you to tell them about the price of hatred. I want you to explain to them what happens when good people start believing that violence is an acceptable way to solve political problems. Because the men who planned the Eastern Front weren't cartoon villains. They were educated, intelligent people who convinced themselves they were saving the world. They were people who thought the ends justified the means, who believed that their cause was so righteous that any amount of suffering was acceptable to achieve it. Sound familiar? And finally, and this is the most important thing I'm going to ask you to do, I want you to make a choice about what kind of ancestor you're going to be. The soldiers who fought on the Eastern Front were somebody's grandfathers, somebody's great-grandfathers. Some of those men went home and spent the rest of their lives trying to make sure nothing like that ever happened again. They taught their children about tolerance and compassion and the value of human life. They became the kind of people who would cross the street to help a stranger, who would stand up for someone being bullied, who understood that civilization is a precious, fragile thing that must be protected by each generation. But others went home filled with bitterness and hatred. They passed their anger on to their children like a poisonous inheritance. They taught the next generation that violence was normal, that might made right, that some people deserve to suffer. Which kind of ancestor do you want to be? I'll tell you something, in 50 years, when your grandchildren are studying the history of our time, what do you want them to say about you? Do you want them to say you were someone who helped bring people together, or someone who drove them apart? Do you want them to say you were someone who chose love over fear, or someone who let hatred consume you? Because make no mistake, we are living through a moment in history right now. The choices we make in the next few years, the way we treat each other, the example we set for the next generation, all of that is going to determine whether the sacrifice of those 27 million people on the Eastern Front meant something, or whether we're doomed to repeat their tragedy in our own way. So here's my challenge to you. When you walk out of here today, when you go home to your families, when you interact with your neighbors and coworkers and fellow citizens, remember what you've learned here. Remember that every person you meet, every single one, is somebody's beloved child. Remember that the person who disagrees with you most strongly is still a human being deserving of dignity and respect.